Welcome back with another video from Liferay. Today, we're going to be going over user acceptance testing with DXP Cloud. Today's learning objectives are going to be understanding what happens before UAT can begin. And that's going to include things like defining who should be on the UAT team. We want to define what the development team is and what their roles are. And we want to define what the UAT team should have as far as defined plans before moving forward. Additionally, we want to learn how to execute the testing phase. We want to understand what questions need to be asked and what problems you should be looking for. And finally, we want to make sure that we're able to document, evaluate, and report in terms of UAT. Jumping right into it, we're going to start with planning. So here we have a diagram of the UAT process. The UAT process revolves around development and planning. First things first, our developers are going to create new code and make customizations. After that, our UAT team is going to go into planning. Here, they're going to plan for the UAT process and jump into the execution. From execution, we're going to go to documentation. From documentation to evaluation. And from evaluation to the development cycle as well. We want to first define basic objectives. What we want to make sure is that all of our business requirements are clear. We want to make sure that the DXP Cloud project meets all the business functions as intended and as written by our business team. Second, we want to determine if the project is usable for the end users. That's going to mean that our DXP Cloud project is easy to use as well as fully functional. The third step will be confirming that the project complies with any legal requirements. Whether that's government mandated or mandated by our business requirements, we want to make sure that we know who has access to what and the people that don't have access are blocked out correctly. Number 4, we want to certify that the entire product is ready for production. This means as bug-free as we can get it and that usability is perfectly fine. Ultimately, the UAT process needs to be defined according to your business's unique needs. So make sure that we have all of those documented well. Before we begin the UAT, we have to set some expectations. We want the project to be functionally stable. This means that no functional defects exist. And if there are any, we need to document them so that we can fix them. And we want to make sure that the UAT is solely focused on being business process validation as opposed to technical validation. The development team should be handling the technical validation. And the UAT team has the final sign-off authority on whether or not to recommend the project move to production. So ultimately, it's on your business UAT team to decide whether or not we continue on with the process. Our next step here is going to be defining the UAT team. So who needs to be on the UAT team? Typically, that's going to be real end users that are going to be using the project whenever possible. That might be stakeholders, management, site content administrators, and site content creators. This is the most important peer group to include as they're going to be the ones who are eventually using the tools that we provide. Every role and stakeholder group should be represented, and we should keep in mind that we want to keep developers out of the UAT process. That way we're free of any bias that might occur. Our next step is going to be creating a checklist for the UAT team. We want to focus on creating a checklist for the development team. Although the development team is not part of the UAT team, we want to make sure that they have a full checklist of things to fix before the UAT process begins. After that, based on the development team's checklist, we'll create a checklist for the UAT team. That's going to test all the functionality that the dev team is going to create. And lastly, from the checklist of the UAT team, we want to create another checklist for the actual execution. This is going to be a little bit more detailed and based on the other two checklists that we've created. For the development team's checklist, we want to make sure that 1, the development team members are aware of their roles. For example, are they going to be advising changes to business procedures or any other kind of functionality? Number 2, we want to define how the development team will support the UAT team during the testing process, whether that means we're sending requirements back for a next sprint or fixing them during that same UAT stage. And 3, we want to make sure that the development team's role in tracking and managing bugs is unambiguous. We want to make sure that they have all that they need to do to keep track of all these bugs and document them. For the UAT team, their checklist includes things like understanding the testing procedures. This might be driven by business requirements. We want to define the UAT team's role in documentation. So we want to make sure that they're aware that they need to document all test cases. We want to make sure that they're testing for all valid and invalid input sources, and we want to make sure that they're documenting all the output results. We want to make sure that they're documenting any bugs or problems that might occur during the testing process. We want to make sure that the UAT team agrees to the testing procedures covered as part of the project's functionality. The UAT team must recognize any necessary changes. For example, if they have maybe some bad business requirements, the UAT team needs to be able to push back. The UAT team must recognize any necessary changes. For example, the UAT team should take a lead role in ensuring the necessary changes are made. For example, if they have bad business requirements, they should be able to push back and let business know that the requirement needs to be changed a little bit. And 5, does the UAT team understand its role in verifying the project is performing to the expected standards, confirming data integrity, making sure that the project is ready for release? Moving on, we have the UAT execution checklist. On this checklist, we want to make sure that the testing plan has been created. For example, these testing procedures need to be defined and put into a trackable system. And 2, we want to make sure that all the project's functionality has been described properly. 3, we want to make sure that all the acceptance criteria has been defined. 4, we want to make sure that all user constraints have been considered. 5, we want to make sure that all test cases have been created for. This means that we want to make sure that all contradictions have been discovered between the requirements and projects. And we want to make sure that all time constraints are met by the system as well. We're going to jump straight into execution. So when we're executing, we want to make sure that we have some testing necessities in place. These are going to be things like available business requirements. So we want to make sure that we have a full list of business requirements available. 2, we want to make sure that our project code is fully developed. 3, we want to make sure that all unit testing, integration testing, regression testing, and system testing are complete. For this one, we want to make sure that we're basically bug-free and that only cosmetic errors are acceptable. The UAT environment must be ready for testing, so fully set up, fully enabled. And the last point is going to be sign-off communication from the system testing team that the project is ready. One important thing to keep in mind is that we want to implement code freezes. So a code freeze is basically when developers stop working on a project and no new customizations or code changes are made. We want to make sure that version control is available when storing all these relevant project data. We want to make sure that we control the source code and make sure that we're only committing the files that need to be committed. For example, we don't want to commit any artifacts that are maybe successful builds or any cache files that don't need to be within the repository. Point number 3, we want to make sure that we understand that we need to version control Liferay's different dependencies, especially those that are in your project. And point number 4, we want to ensure that changes aren't made to the code once they're submitted for the UAT testing. Otherwise, we're going to have to restart the entire cycle. After the code freeze, we want to start deploying to that UAT environment. Some key things to keep in mind are that we want to mimic the production environment as much as possible. So our UAT environment should be more or less a clone of our production environment. Similarly, deployment should look as close as possible to the production as well. If we have any deployment procedures in place in production, we need to make sure that those are mirrored inside of UAT. For DXP Cloud, we should keep in mind that we need to have the latest code, the latest data, the latest changes. We want to make sure that we have the same environment variables. We want to make sure that the UAT environment is prepared similarly to how the production environment is prepared. We want to make sure that we're regularly promoting to the UAT environment. And the last point is we want to make sure that the same or similar memory and CPU allocation is given to the UAT environment as the production environment. In terms of accessing the UAT environment, some key things to keep in mind are that the UAT environment uses Nginx as its web server, and that all of the Nginx configuration includes password protection. This protection can be configured in the liferay.configuration file, and we want to make sure that everybody on the UAT team has access to it. The next slide is going to be verifying that the project works for your users. So at this point, we've actually started the UAT process. We want to make sure that we have 2 groups of questions, and those 2 groups are general testing questions. For example, does it even work? Is our functionality working the way it's intended to be working? And our second group of questions is user-specific testing. So similar to the general testing, but in this case, it's targeted towards specific users. For example, does this functionality work for user A? How does it differ from user A to user B? For the general testing questions, we want to make sure that 1, the application doesn't crash when we're using the functionality. 2, do all the functions accept the correct inputs and give the correct outputs? 3, does the project consume only the minimum amount of resources? That's for things like making sure that our performance is good. And 4, what's the load time of the application? Is it going to be a fast experience for our users? We want to make sure, 1, can the user use software? 2, is the project really what the user is requiring or what they're asking for? 3, does the user experience any trouble while using it? These are going to be things like bugs or maybe just bad UI or UX. And number 4, does the project behave in the way that the user expects? For test execution, we're also going to have a checklist. We want to make sure that the acceptance test is performed according to the test plan. 2, services are provided by the project in compliance with the user requirements that are driven. 3, each user is signed off on output. And 4, we want to generate regular test summary reports. That way we have some documentation to look at afterwards. Which leads us into our next step, documentation. Documentation in UAT is very important. Really, testing is only as valuable as the documented results. So if we're not keeping track of these testing results, then none of this UAT means anything really. 2, documenting the outcomes of testing is really necessary to analyze and improve future outcomes. So again, if we're not documenting this, we don't have any sort of history to look back upon. UAT testing needs to be iterative, so this will help improve each iteration significantly. And the last point is going to be that documentation can take various forms. Maybe the most common thing that we see is like a bug tracking tool so that we can keep track of all the bugs that we've both logged and created. For our documentation checklist, what we want to make sure is that we're ensuring the test log is up to date. We want to document each step of each test run. We want to document each of the defects and how they were found. So that's going to be things like reproduction steps, make sure that we can hit the bug and hit it recurringly. And it doesn't matter how small these bugs are, we want to make sure to document them. And the last point is going to be ensuring that the incidents are reported accurately and in good time. So we want to make sure that our documentation is fresh, and especially if our UAT user is doing many bugs, we want to make sure that they're getting those in as they hit those bugs. After documentation, we want to take that documentation and start our evaluation of the UAT process. So for our evaluation checklist, we want to make sure that all of our users have reviewed the test results. We want to make sure that all the identified defects and issues need to be resolved. And we want to make sure that all the users have judged acceptability in accordance with the predetermined criteria. We do have Liferay support available, and Liferay's support team is happy to help resolve any issues found after UAT. Your CSS member is going to be your first line of defense for any Liferay specific questions found after UAT. Taking this all back to some of the lessons that we've learned today, what we learned in the iteration process is that we need to look at documentation and come up with these lessons learned. So not necessarily only issues with the project, but any issues with the UAT process so that we can improve the UAT process going forward. And we want to make sure that we're actually iterating the process. So this is going to occur when we have the UAT team look at the lessons learned and go back to the planning phase and make sure that we're improving it as we go. And we want to make sure that the development team is fixing issues that are found in the last round of UAT before the next round of testing. One last little look at the overview of the UAT process. We're going to start with planning. We're going to define all of our basic objectives. We're going to make sure that we have the proper UAT team in place, and we're going to create a planning checklist. After that, we're going to go straight into execution. We're going to implement our code freeze, meaning developers can't create any new content. We're going to deploy that to UAT as you would to production with the same exact steps, and then we're going to test the usability. After that, we're going to document every bug that we find, make sure that we have a nicely documented list of things that we need to fix going forward. After documentation, we're going to go into evaluation. We're going to create another checklist based on what we've documented, and we're going to contact Liferay support for any Liferay specific issues. That wraps up this video. We'll see you in the next one.